Welcome everyone to a long list of paranormal encounters, which will include specific cases of hauntings, ghost encounters, and basically anything that falls in the paranormal realm. As we go down the list of these cases, these will get really obscure since most of them only have one source, so stay tuned for some really interesting cases. Anyways, I'm really happy to be back posting, and I hope you all liked the video, so let's get straight into it. Legion of the Damned. In the early 1950s, a young apprentice plumber named Harry Martindale was working in the basement of the treasurer's house near York Minster. He was repairing a boiler and was about to pack up his tools when he heard a strange trumpet sound. At first, he thought it might be a brass band playing outside, so he paid little attention. Then he heard a second blast much louder and seemingly closer, coming from the far end of the cellar. Harry, curious and a bit uneasy, looked around the dimly lit basement but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just as he was about to continue packing up, he was suddenly overcome with fear. A horse's head emerged from the wall at the far end of the cellar. Following the horse, a rider appeared, then 15 Roman soldiers. The soldiers looked weary and worn, paying no attention to Harry as they marched across the cellar floor, only to vanish in the opposite wall. Harry, hidden behind the boiler, was frozen in shock at what he had just witnessed. After regaining his composure, he quickly gathered his belongings and bolted up the stairs. He burst out of the building, gasping for breath, trying to understand what he had just seen. It had been so vivid that he couldn't believe it was just his imagination. He considered telling someone about what he saw, but worried that they would think he was crazy, so he decided to keep it to himself. For 20 years, Harry remained silent about his encounter. It was when he read an article in a local newspaper about 2 other people who had seen similar apparitions in the same spot in the cellar that he decided to come forward. Harry went on to describe the soldiers in detail. They wore shabby green kilted skirts, roughly dyed, and carried long spears and short swords. They also had round shields, which was unusual for the Roman army. The greatest detail though was that the soldiers appeared to be cut off at the knees, with the lower halves of their legs disappearing into the floor. Around the same time, archaeologists were excavating in the cellar area and discovered an old Roman road about 18 inches below the modern floor level. This discovery explained why the soldiers appeared to be cut off at the knees, being that they were walking on the old road which was lower than the current floor. By the time he came forward with his account, Harry had become a police officer and was known as an honest and reliable person. His reputation lent credibility to his account, and he was interviewed by experts in Roman history, and he insisted that he knew little about Roman history, other than what he had seen in movies, and that he had no interest in ghosts or the paranormal. He swore that his account of what he had seen was true. The experts examined the details Harry provided. After some research, they discovered that auxiliary forces of the Roman army had been stationed in York towards the end of the Roman occupation. These forces would have worn green kilted skirts and carried round shields, just as Harry described. Harry maintained that he had never experienced anything paranormal before or since that day in the cellar. It was suggested that the Roman soldiers might have been a mercenary force attached to the Roman legion, perhaps defeated by the Picts during the collapse of Roman Britain. The true identity of the ghostly figures though still remains a mystery, but Harry's detailed and consistent account, along with the evidence from other witnesses and archaeological findings, suggests that he experienced something truly extraordinary that day in the cellar. No one knows for sure though, so let me know what you guys think. Moffat family haunting. When Jessica Moffat was growing up in Rancho Cucamonga, California, her family kept many secrets. Her grandmother constantly warned her and her brothers to never speak about anything unusual that they witnessed at home. This strict silence made Jessica very cautious about what she said to others, fearing that any slip might reveal the strange details of her home life. The family's house, while looking ordinary from outside, held many oddities inside. Smooth patches on the walls, some with faint triangular shapes, were scattered throughout the house. The second floor was always off limits, always shrouded in a shadow that seemed to deter anyone from venturing up there. Jessica's father moved cautiously throughout the house after dark, needing an escort to leave the bedroom. Her grandmother would panic if anything was out of place, launching into frantic prayers. Despite Jessica's curiosity though, her mother always reassured her that everything was fine. However, Jessica sensed something was very wrong. Her father attributed his behavior to nerves and poor health, while her grandmother offered no explanation for her panic. Thus, Jessica grew up with an undefined dread, finding refuge in the silence her grandmother demanded. Her childhood was marked by these strange occurrences and behaviors. Her mother tried to involve the children in social activities, but Jessica preferred solitude, hiding away in the house. This isolation continued until college, where Jessica struggled to adapt to a new environment full of confident peers. The family silence continued until after Jessica's father died in 2012, 3 years after her grandmother had passed away. The first bit of explanation that Jessica got was while cleaning out a bedroom closet, Jessica's mother revealed a collection of photographs depicting bizarre and horrifying scenes, being a knife thrust into a picture of Jessica's grandmother, strange shapes scratched into doors, and messages like "Lee die" written on mirrors. Jessica's grandmother's name was Lee. Her mother explained that in 1987, 3 years before Jessica was born, their home had been invaded by an unknown presence, which revealed itself with the message "No escape" written on a bathroom mirror. The entity began terrorizing the family, causing a lot of destruction and leaving messages that suggested that it had some sort of intelligence. Paranormal experts, including Dr. Evelyn Paglini and Ed and Lorraine Warren, were consulted, but no one could explain why the entity targeted their family. Lorraine Warren even considered it one of the most ancient and powerful demons she had ever encountered. Jessica's grandmother believed that the entity was punishment for the sins of her father, a hitman for the Cosa Nostra family. The entity claimed that Jessica's grandmother belonged to it and launched vicious attacks against her, destroying her possessions and making her life a nightmare. The family tried to leave the house, but it seemed like the entity always followed them wherever they went, leaving symbols and causing havoc in hotels and other temporary refuges. The haunting though eventually ended after Jessica's mother confronted the entity, telling it to leave. The entity agreed reluctantly, but a paranormal researcher living with the family at the time asked it to go with him, believing it could change his life. When the researcher left in 1992, the activity ceased, and the entity's last message was, "Goodbye, my family." Despite the end of the haunting, the fear instilled remained. Jessica's father and grandmother continued to live in fear, always on guard. The Entity House. The Entity House in Culver City, Los Angeles gained notoriety because of the experiences of Doris Bither and her 4 sons in the early 1970s. Bither, who suffered from health and personal issues, reported disturbing encounters with invisible entities. Her story caught the attention of parapsychologists Barry Taff and Carrie Gaynor, who worked at UCLA's parapsychology lab. Their investigation began on August 22, 1974, after Bither approached them with their experiences, including an attack by 3 spirits. During the interviews, Bither described hearing loud bangs, seeing lights flicker, and feeling an eerie presence in the house. She also mentioned suffering from sleep paralysis, which Taff and Gaynor initially considered a possible explanation for her claims. These accounts included hearing phantom noises, seeing Bither thrown around, and witnessing her son being attacked, resulting in a broken arm. Taff and Gaynor's investigation revealed various strange occurrences. They noted the flickering lights and documented objects moving on their own. During one interview with Bither's children, cabinet doors reportedly flew open, and pots and pans crashed to the floor without any apparent cause. They took numerous photographs capturing orbs and sheets of white fuzz in several images. These phenomena suggested a significant paranormal presence in the house. One of the most intense moments during the investigation, though, involved Bither attempting to summon the spirits by cursing and yelling at them. It was said that this incited activity, with lights turning on and a large green fog appearing, which formed into the torso of a man. Some researchers described the figure as large and muscular, but with no discernible face. Despite all these occurrences though, photographic evidence only captured a bright white orb before the camera had failed. The whole investigation lasted 10 weeks, with nearly 30 researchers visiting the home. They concluded that Bither should definitely leave the house, and after she left, further photographs showed no signs of the previous paranormal activity. Despite moving to Texas, Bither and her family continued to experience hauntings, leading them to relocate to an undisclosed location. Doris Bither passed away in 1995 from pulmonary arrest, but rumors persisted that she may have been pregnant with a child fathered by one of these entities. The Battle of Edgehill. The Battle of Edgehill, a clash during the English Civil War, took place in Warwickshire on October 23, 1642. The battle saw the parliamentarians retreat to Warwick while the royalists moved south, neither side achieving a decisive victory. The aftermath, though, left the field strewn with corpses, hastily buried in mass graves, and the survivors dependent on local charity. And a royalist account from Kyneton described the dire condition of maimed soldiers abandoned without aid. The story of Edgehill, though, doesn't end with the departure of the armies. The area soon became known for its ghostly apparitions, starting close to Christmas. Shepherds near the battlefield heard distinct drums and the groans of soldiers. As the sounds grew nearer, they saw a vision of two spectral armies clashing, complete with the noise of cannons, muskets, and the cries of men and horses. Terrified, the shepherds stood rooted to the spot, watching the ghostly battle for hours until it vanished. These apparitions were then reported to local authorities, including Mr. Wood, a justice of the peace, and Mr. Marshall, a minister. Then, the following night, villagers from Kyneton and surrounding areas gathered and witnessed the same ghostly battle. They too saw the two armies engage in fierce combat before the specters disappeared once more. The repeated sightings and the growing alarm among villagers prompted a report to King Charles I, who was based in Oxford. A royal commission of 6 officers, all veterans of the battle, was then dispatched to investigate. They visited the battlefield and confirmed the apparitions, even identifying some of the spectral soldiers. It was said that among them was Sir Edmund Verney, the king's standard bearer, who had lost his hand during the battle. The officer's report was then published in a document on January 23, 1643. This document remains the only ghost encounter officially recognized by the British Public Record Office. The officers concluded that the apparitions were a divine sign of displeasure with the Civil War. In response, locals began retrieving the bodies still on the battlefield, ensuring they received Christian burials in hope of bringing peace to their souls. Although the apparitions reportedly ceased after these efforts, many have since claimed to hear echoes of cannon fire, battle cries, and horses' hooves around the anniversary of the battle, particularly on misty nights. SML Haunting. The SML Haunting is a case involving Jack and Janet Smurl, who resided in West Pittston, Pennsylvania. They claimed that their home was haunted by a demon from 1974 to 1989. The case garnered a lot of media attention and involved investigations by various experts, including demonologists Ed and Lorraine Warren. The haunting even inspired a book titled The Haunted and a made-for-TV movie of the same name. It all started when the Smurls moved into their home on Chase Street in August 1973. Shortly after, they began experiencing disturbances that they attributed to a demonic presence. The disturbances included loud noises, foul odors, and physical assaults. The family dog was reportedly thrown against the wall, their mattress shook violently, and one of their daughters was pushed down a flight of stairs. On several occasions, there were even family members who claimed to have been physically and SA by the entity. The disturbances kept on escalating, prompting the Smurls to seek help from Ed and Lorraine Warren in 1986. The Warrens, known for their work in demonology, investigated the home and described the demon as very powerful, as quoted. According to Ed Warren, the demon shook mirrors and furniture when they attempted to drive it away with religious music and prayers. Warren also reported seeing a dark mask and feeling a significant drop in temperature. The demon allegedly even left a message on the mirror instructing him to get out. Throughout their investigation, the Warrens claimed to have captured audio recordings of knocking and rapping noises produced by the demon. Despite these claims, though, skeptics like Professor Paul Kurtz of the State University of New York at Buffalo criticized the Warrens' approach, labeling them as biased and unscientific. Kurtz suggested that the Smurls' experiences could be explained by psychological factors like delusions, hallucinations, or brain impairment. He advised the family to undergo psychiatric and psychological evaluations. The Roman Catholic Diocese of Scranton were also involved, but their representatives were unsure about the cause of the disturbances. Several priests also blessed their home but reported no harmful activity during their visits. Janice Smurl claimed that a priest performed 3 unsuccessful exorcisms, stating that the demon evaded the rites by moving between the 2 halves of the double-block home and following the family to other locations. In 1986, a local priest spent 2 nights at the Smurl residence and reported no unusual occurrences. Despite the media attention and ongoing disturbances, the Smurls co-authored a book titled The Haunted with the Warrens and Scranton newspaper writer Robert Curran. The book faced criticism for its lack of empirical evidence and one-sided narrative. Some reviewers, like Joseph Marusuk, questioned the credibility of the authors, while others criticized the book's writing quality. In 1987, the Smurls reported that the disturbances had decreased, but had not completely ceased. They eventually ended up moving to Wilkes-Barre, where they continued to experience minor paranormal activity. The house in West Pittston was later occupied by Deborah Owens, who reported no supernatural occurrences during her time there. Marfa Lights in Texas. The Marfa Lights are a well-known phenomenon observed near Marfa, Texas. These lights, often referred to as ghost lights, have been seen for decades and are typically observed from a viewing area near Marfa, where they appear as glowing orbs that change in intensity and color. It's said that these lights can move, remain stationary, merge, or split apart, with colors ranging from yellow-orange to green, blue, and red. The first recorded sighting dates back to 1883 when a young cowhand named Robert Reed Ellison saw a flickering light while driving cattle through Paisano Pass. Initially, he thought it might be a campfire, but upon investigation, he found no evidence of a campsite. Since then, numerous sightings have been reported, with various people attributing the lights to paranormal activity, including ghosts, UFOs, and other unexplained phenomena. And over the years, many attempts have been made to explain the Marfa Lights. Skeptics often attribute the lights to car headlights on nearby Route 67, which are distorted by atmospheric conditions. However, some sightings, including those that move backward, dance around, or disappear suddenly, remain unexplained. The lights have also been speculated to result from natural methane reserves or piezoelectric charges created by the igneous rock under Mitchell Flat. One significant study was conducted by the Society of Physics students from the University of Texas at Dallas in May 2004. They spent 4 days investigating the lights using various equipment, including traffic volume monitoring tools, video cameras, and chase cars. Their findings suggested that the lights observed southwest of the View Park could be attributed to automobile headlights on US Highway 67. They concluded that the frequency and movement of the lights correlated with vehicle traffic, and experiments with flashing headlights confirmed that car lights could appear as Marfa lights. In May 2008, scientists from Texas State University conducted another investigation using spectroscopy equipment. They observed lights from the Marfa Lights viewing station for 20 nights and recorded several instances where the lights could have been mistaken for something mysterious. However, their data indicated that all observed lights could be explained as automobile headlights or small fires. Despite these findings though, the rarity of genuine Marfa lights with odd behavior not attributable to car lights prompted calls for further research. The Ghost of Anne Boleyn. Henry VIII's marriage to Anne Boleyn is one of history's most dramatic stories. Desperate for a male heir, Henry reformed the Catholic Church, divorcing his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, to marry Anne. Despite his efforts, Anne gave birth only to a daughter, the future Queen Elizabeth I. When it became clear that Anne would not provide a male heir, Henry had her executed for high treason in 1536. The aftermath of Anne's execution and Henry's later marriages left a significant impact on England, but it's Anne's ghostly presence that continues to interest the imagination. Many believe Anne's spirit still roams various locations in England. The Tower of London is perhaps the most famous site associated with Anne's ghost. This historic fortress was where she was imprisoned and executed. Numerous accounts describe sightings of her ghost within the tower's walls. For example, in 1864, a guard reportedly saw a figure in white and, thinking it was an intruder, charged at it with a bayonet, only for the weapon to pass through the apparition. It's said that he fainted upon realizing he had confronted a ghost. Another notable encounter involved a guard who noticed flickering lights from the locked Chapel Royal. Climbing a ladder to investigate, he saw a procession of figures in 16th century attire, led by a woman resembling Anne Bolin. Anne's ghost is also said to appear at Hever Castle, her childhood home. Sightings of her ghost often occur around Christmas, her favorite time of year. People have reported seeing her sitting under the oak tree where she and Henry VIII courted, or walking across the bridge over Eden Lake. These sightings suggest that Anne's spirit is drawn to places where she experienced happiness. And at Blickling Hall, her birthplace, a more eerie tale is told. It's said that each year on the anniversary of her execution, a carriage pulled by 4 headless horses and driven by a headless coachman is said to arrive at the hall. Anne, holding her severed head, is believed to step out and roam the grounds until sunrise. Other locations associated with Anne's ghost include Sally Church, where some believe she was buried, and Windsor Castle, where she has been seen standing at a window. Reports of her ghost at these places further the idea that Anne's spirit is not bound to one location. In each of these encounters, Anne's ghost appears as a reminder of a tragic life and untimely death. The Greenbrier Ghost. The Greenbrier Ghost refers to the spirit of Elva Zahner Hester Shue, a woman from Greenbrier County, West Virginia, who was murdered in 1897. Her death was initially considered natural, but later events revealed it to be a murder committed by her husband. The revelation came after her mother, Mary Jane Hester, claimed that Zona's ghost visited her, revealing the truth about her death. In October 1896, Elva Zona Hester met Erasmus Stribling Trout Shue, a blacksmith, and married him. On January 23, 1897, Zona was found dead in her home. Her death was attributed to childbirth, and she was buried the next day in the local cemetery. Mary Jane Hester, Zona's mother, later reported that her daughter's ghost appeared to her at night. The apparition allegedly revealed that Erasmus had murdered her. Armed with this information, Mary Jane went to the local prosecutor, John Alfred Preston. Despite skepticism about the ghost story, the prosecutor agreed to reopen the investigation. Deputies re-interviewed key individuals, including Dr. Knapp, who admitted that he had not conducted a thorough investigation of the body. This was enough to justify an exhumation and autopsy. On February 22, 1897, Zona's body was examined, and it was found that her neck had been broken. The autopsy report detailed that her neck was dislocated between the first and second vertebrae, the windpipe was crushed, and there were finger marks on her throat indicating strangulation. Erasmus Shue was then arrested and charged with the murder. While awaiting trial, more details about Shue's past emerged. He had been married twice before, with his first marriage ending in divorce due to alleged cruelty and his second wife dying under mysterious circumstances. Zona was his third wife, and he openly spoke of wanting to marry 7 women. He believed he would be acquitted due to a lack of evidence. The trial began on June 22, 1897. Mary Jane Hester was the star witness, and her testimony included the ghostly visits, which were brought up by Shue's defense in an attempt to discredit her. However, Mary Jane's steadfast account did not waver, and the judge found it challenging to instruct the jury to disregard the ghost story. Despite the ghost story being introduced by the defense though, Shue was found guilty of murder on July 11th and sentenced to life in prison. He then died in 1900 in the West Virginia State Penitentiary due to an unknown epidemic. West Virginia even erected a state historical marker near Zona's grave, acknowledging the unique nature of the case, where ghost testimony allegedly played a role in solving a murder. The story of the Greenbrier Ghost has since inspired books, plays, musicals, and even a feature on the television show Drunk History. Brown Lady of Raynham Hall. The Brown Lady of Raynham Hall is a well-known ghost purported to haunt Raynham Hall in Norfolk, England. The The ghost gained a lot of attention due to a photograph taken by Country Life magazine photographers, which is believed to show the spectral figure. The ghost is named for the brown brocade dress that it reportedly wears, and it's said to be the spirit of Dorothy Walpole, sister of Robert Walpole, who was Britain's first Prime Minister. Dorothy Walpole was the second wife of Charles Townshend, who allegedly imprisoned her in Raynham Hall after discovering her infidelity. She remained there until her death in 1726 from smallpox. The first recorded sighting of the Brown Lady was in 1835 during a Christmas gathering at Raynham Hall. So the first recorded sighting of the Brown Lady was in 1835 during a Christmas gathering at Raynham Hall. Colonel Loftus and another guest reported seeing a figure in a brown dress as they approached their bedrooms. Loftus claimed to have seen the figure again the next night, noting its empty eye sockets and a glowing face. These sightings caused some staff to leave the hall permanently. In 1836, Captain Frederick Maria, a friend of Charles Dickens, decided to investigate the haunting. He stayed in a room where the apparition had often been seen and kept a loaded revolver under his pillow. On the third night, he and two companions saw a lamp approaching them in the corridor. They hid behind doors as the figure passed, but Maria, recognizing the Brown Lady, leapt out and fired his revolver at the ghost, which disappeared instantly. The bullet was found lodged in a door panel, confirming the encounter for Maria and his companions. The ghost was reportedly seen again in 1926 by Lady Townshend's son and his friend on the staircase, where they identified it with a portrait of Lady Dorothy Walpole. However, sightings became less frequent after Marriott's encounter, with some claiming the Brown Lady now haunts nearby Houghton Hall and Sandringham House. On September 19, 1936, photographers from Country Life magazine, Captain Hubert C. Provand and his assistant Indra Shira were taking photos of Raynham Hall for an article. Shira said she saw a vaporous form descending the stairs and quickly directed Provand to take a photograph. The developed photo revealed the now famous image of the Brown Lady. The account and photograph were then published in Country Life magazine on December 26, 1936, and in Life magazine on January 4, 1937. The noted paranormal investigator Harry Price interviewed the photographers and concluded that the story was credible, with no evidence of collusion or faking. Skeptics, however, have proposed several alternative explanations. Some suggest that Shira might have faked the image by using grease or similar substance on the lens or creating a double exposure. Joe Nickel argued that the photograph shows evidence of double exposure. John Fairley and Simon Welfare noted pale lines above each stair tread indicating superimposition and a patch of reflected light appearing twice. Magician John Booth recreated a similar photograph using natural methods, and other critics pointed out that the ghostly figure closely resembles a standard Virgin Mary statue. The SS Watertown Ghost. The story of the ghosts of the SS Watertown begins in January 1925, when sailors James Courtney and Michael Meehan lost their lives in a maritime accident aboard the oil tanker Watertown. Their bodies were then given a burial at sea, which was a common practice for sailors who died far from shore. Soon after, the crew began to report seeing the faces of the two men in the water, as if they were swimming alongside the ship. These apparitions were described as clearly visible and easily recognizable as Courtney and Meehan. The sightings really creeped out the crew, which led the captain to attempt to capture photographic evidence. He took a series of photographs the next time the ghostly faces appeared. Out of 6 photographs, 5 showed nothing unusual. However, the 6th photograph seemed to capture the eerie faces of the two sailors in the waves. This image became really widely known and even made its way into City Service's headquarters as a blown-up picture, according to some versions of the tale. Skeptics have long argued that the photograph is a result of pareidolia, the tendency to see familiar patterns like faces in random stimuli. The claim that the faces looked exactly like the sailors did in life is often met with humor, as it suggests that they were featureless blobs lacking in distinct features like eyes, hair, and teeth. This raises questions about how the appearance was so recognizable. Paranormal researcher Blake Smith even devoted over a decade to investigating this famous photograph. His research revealed that the photograph first appeared in City Services' in-house magazine in the mid-1930s, where it was found by psychic researcher Hereward Carrington. The more commonly known version of the photograph, though, was published in a 1963 issue of Fate magazine, produced by ufologist Michael G. Mann. This version of the photograph had been cropped and edited, raising Smith's suspicions about its authenticity. Mann's family later claimed that he renounced paranormal beliefs and discarded his collection of photographs. Smith, with the help of photographic expert Joe Nickel, then conducted a detailed analysis of the photograph. They discovered signs of tampering, like sharp edges on the more indistinct left face, suggesting it had been cut and pasted. Further investigation into Watertown's sister ship revealed that the faces in the photograph would have needed to be between 5 and 10 feet tall to appear as they did. This led Smith to conclude that the photograph was likely a hoax. Years later, Smith found newspaper articles confirming the non-paranormal aspects of the story. Courtney and Mihan had indeed died in a tragic accident while trying to clean the ship's exhaust system, and their deaths were pretty gruesome. He also found the first newspaper appearance of the ghosts, which occurred a decade after their deaths, along with an uncropped version of the photograph that lacked obvious signs of tampering. In the uncropped photograph, the Watertown is shown weathering a storm, a dramatic image of life at sea. The ghostly faces, if present, are much less distinct, hidden in the upper right-hand corner among the sea mist. This version of the photograph is less convincing as evidence of the paranormal, as the faces are more blobby and indistinct. The left face resembles a lump of water and sea foam, while the right face sort of looks like a face but not convincingly so. Smith's research suggested that even this photograph might have been altered, possibly as part of a joke or a lighthearted story created by an imaginative employee at City Services. If this photograph was indeed a hoax, though, the more famous cropped and altered version would be a hoax within a hoax, showing a remarkable dedication to creating and perpetuating a ghost story. Alright, onto Tier 2, the April Ghost. On September 22, 1936, a Tuesday evening in Oak Bay, Doris Gravlin announced that she was going for a walk. Doris, a 30-year-old private nurse, had more on her mind than enjoying the evening air, being she planned to meet her estranged husband, Victor, at the Oak Bay Beach Hotel to discuss the possibility of reconciliation. Their 2-year separation had been caused by Victor's alcoholism, which had led to his mental depression and physical decline. Victor, a 36-year-old sports writer, wanted to change his ways and arranged the meeting with Doris. After leaving the hotel, Doris and Victor may have decided to walk along the nearby Victoria Golf Course. The exact details of their walk are sort of unknown, but around 9 o'clock that night, a resident near the golf course heard a dreadful scream. Doris and Victor were never seen alive again. 5 days later, a caddy searching for a lost ball discovered Doris's beaten body. She was missing some articles of clothing, including her white kid leather shoes. The authorities called the case one of the most mysterious they had encountered in years. They enlisted the help of police from 3 other municipalities, the provincial force, and a corps of Boy Scouts to search the area. Despite their efforts, it was a fisherman who found Victor's body floating face down in a web of kelp near the ninth tee. Doris's missing shoes were tucked into the inside pocket of his jacket. 4 weeks after the discovery of Doris's body, the police closed the case, assuming that the reconciliation attempt had failed and that Victor, in a desperate mental state, had killed Doris and then himself. The media was willing to let the case fade quietly, possibly due to Victor's popularity as a sports writer and his uncle's executive position at a local newspaper. However, Doris seemed unwilling to be forgotten. By the following spring, she had returned to the golf course as a ghost. As a ghost, Doris garnered far more publicity than she had as a murder victim, often described as BC's most famous ghost. She appeared countless times in the 60 years since her brutal death. She materialized every spring, earning the nickname the April Ghost. She was sometimes seen as a misty gray figure skimming over the rocky landscape by the water. Other times she appeared very real, dressed in an old-fashioned brown suit, walking on the golf course or standing by the side of the road. Most frequently though, Doris appeared in a flowing white wedding gown. Her appearances in this dress had a sense of purpose, often terrifying people by rushing towards them with arms outstretched, then melting into a pool of bright light before disappearing. According to folklore, young couples who saw her this way were destined never to marry. Given the circumstances of her death, Doris could hardly be criticized for her dim view of marriage. Although the April ghost was not considered a threatening presence, witnesses were often frightened by her eerie appearances. Her swift, unnatural movements seemed menacing, and her manifestation was usually preceded by a darkening mood, with a rising directionless wind and clammy coldness. The ghost's awareness of her human spectators often inspired paranoid fear. In her book ESP Especially Ghost, author Aileen Sonnen relayed the story of a cab driver named George Drysdale who had been skeptical until his own encounter with Doris. Basically, walking along the golf course with his sister and friends one moonlit night, George saw a girl standing in front of him. Her sudden, frightening appearance made him instinctively turn away, and she appeared again wherever he turned. His group watched in shock as he seemed trapped by the apparition. Then, as suddenly as she appeared, she vanished. Years later, George was convinced he had seen the ghost of the murdered girl. On April 9, 1964, the Vancouver province reported that a teenager named Anthony Gregson had been unnerved by seeing the April ghost running across the rocks on the beach. He described the specter as a luminous gray shape gliding swiftly over the landscape, not touching the ground. Though he saw the ghost from a distance, his reaction was strong, and he vowed not to return. Even when appearing human, Doris managed to upset those who saw her. Often seen walking along the golf course in the late afternoon, she initially seemed unremarkable until passerby felt an unexplainable sense of dread. Looking back, they saw her dressed in an old-fashioned brown suit, possibly what she wore in her final hours. And an American tourist and his companion once saw Doris in her more human form. Driving by the golf course, they stopped at an intersection for a young woman in a long white dress crossing the road. Moments later, they stopped again for another woman in a similar dress. 3 blocks down the road, seeing yet another woman in a white dress waiting to cross, the friend, frightened, urged the driver to keep going. The next day, hearing about the April ghost on a radio talk show, they were convinced that they had seen Doris. The Cambria County Ghost Cow. Elmer Person, the city editor for the Pennsylvania Great newspaper, reported a strange occurrence on the outskirts of Johnston. Residents spoke of an old ruined building where they claimed to see a friendly cow ghost with glowing eyes and a loud, disturbing moo. The building had been a slaughterhouse where many cows had been killed. The butcher who worked there left the place for unknown reasons, and it soon became abandoned. Over time, the building gained a reputation for being haunted. Elmer Person interviewed many locals who said that they seen the ghostly cow near the old slaughterhouse. These witnesses told similar stories, and Person believed they were telling the truth. The ghost cow was described as having no head, with a bleeding neck stump and its severed head floating in front of its body. The eyes of the head glowed with a greenish light, and its teeth were sharp and jagged. The cow's mouth was always open, but the loud mooing sound came from its neck, and it said that this sound could be even heard from really far away. At night, the ghost cow could be seen moving along the side of the road, and it seemed to float above the ground and then briefly land on fences and walls before floating again. Witnesses said that they saw the cow come out of the building and move past them very quickly. One reliable witness described how the cow came out of the slaughterhouse, followed a fence, and then moved along a stone wall before turning back and going back into the building. Just before I went inside, the cow let out a very loud moo and then vanished. This witness, like many others, swore never to go near that road at night again. The area around the slaughterhouse used to be a well-traveled path, but after the ghost cow appeared, people started to avoid it. They chose to go around the place instead of through it because they were scared that it might appear. Some people think this might be a folktale or a scare story about the abandoned building, and there are questions about whether the building was really a slaughterhouse or if that detail was added to the story. Research into the story found that the building likely no longer exists. However, there are other reports of ghost cows in the United States. For example, in Brownsville, Texas, there is a road where people have seen a ghost cow appear in front of their cars. The primary source for this story is the August 9, 1896 issue of the World newspaper of New York. Elmer Person's report and the stories from the locals give a clear picture of the strange events near Johnstown. The Hedy Frederickson story. In December of 1965, Hedy and Douglas Frederickson moved into a large 12-room home on William Street in Chilliwack. The house seemed ideal at first, but it quickly became the center of one of the strangest and most disturbing experiences of their lives. Initially, the odd occurrences were subtle. They heard noises of breathing and footsteps on the stairs, and the scent of perfume would suddenly fill the air. There were also bureau drawers in an unused bedroom that refused to stay shut. One night, Hedy saw the misty, glowing shape of a person in that same bedroom. These incidents were disturbing, but Hedy found herself deeply disturbed by a recurring nightmare. In her dream, she saw the body of a woman lying on the attic floor. The woman wore a bright cotton dress, red with large yellow flowers, and her expression was one of pure terror. This vision haunted Hedy night after night. As an artist, Hedy decided to deal with it the best way she knew, by painting what she saw in her nightmare. She combined the image of the woman from her dream with the ghost she had seen in the upstairs bedroom. Hedy had few details of the ghost's appearance, so she left half of the face in her portrait blank. After many days, the painting was finished, and Hedy hoped that the creative process had exorcised the supernatural beings from the house. But her hope was in vain. About a week later, Hedy noticed something unbelievable about her painting. Without being touched at all, the blank portion of the face was filling itself in, revealing the features of a man right down to his mustache. Reports of the haunted painting then began to circulate around Chilliwack, along with stories about the house's history. Hedy heard that an old man who lived there had taken his own life, and that a woman had been murdered and bricked up in the chimney. Hedy and Douglas didn't know if these tales were true, but they knew their own experiences were real. The footsteps, the breathing sounds, the scent of perfume, and the moving furniture persisted. The painting continued to change, seemingly on its own. A thorough exploration of the house then revealed a hidden door, a boarded over passageway, and a small, previously undiscovered turret room. Hedy and Douglas began to wonder what dark secrets their home held. All the while, publicity of the mysterious painting grew, attracting curious visitors to the house. One Sunday afternoon in June 1966, nearly 700 sightseers came to see the house, causing the old wooden porch to collapse under their weight. For weeks, an estimated 200 cars drove down to William Street every day to glimpse the ghost house. Eventually, it wasn't the ghost that drove the Fredericksons away, but the tourists. Overwhelmed by the constant attention, Hedy and Douglas packed their belongings and moved to Seward, a small town on Vancouver Island. They took the strange painting but left the haunting behind them. Though the publicity died down, paranormal activity at the Fredericksons' old house continued. Subsequent tenants reported encountering several ghosts, including a malevolent presence that could immobilize people for several minutes. It's said that a delivery person once dropped her packages and ran in terror after seeing the supernatural appearance of a woman and a baby on the porch. The San Pedro Haunting. In the late 80s, Jackie Hernandez, a single mother, moved into a bungalow in San Pedro, California with her 2 children. Eager to start a new chapter after a rocky marriage, Jackie was optimistic despite the challenges of parenting, working multiple jobs, and attending school. However, she soon discovered that her new home was haunted by an entity that made its presence known in some disturbing ways. The haunting began with disembodied voices and objects moving on their own. Jackie heard bumps in the night and saw items inexplicably shift. The activity escalated, and within the first year, she witnessed a full-bodied apparition of an old man looming over her son Jamie's bed. The apparition gave her a malicious glare before vanishing. This frightening encounter was just the beginning though. The ghost's presence grew more violent, turning the family's life into a nightmare. Jackie confided in her neighbor Susan, who witnessed some of the strange events. One day, Susan heard a loud crash from the kitchen during a visit. To their horror, they discovered that a painting had been torn off the wall, leaned against the sink with the nails placed pointed side up on the floor. Friends and babysitters also reported experiencing paranormal activity in the house, confirming to Jackie that she was not imagining things. Jackie began documenting the events, noting foul-smelling liquids materializing in the kitchen and strange balls of lights with no apparent source. The activities seemed to center around the attic though. One day, Jackie traced a blood-like substance oozing into the kitchen up to the attic. When she opened the hatch, she saw the disembodied head of the old man she had seen in Jamie's room. Seeking help, Jackie contacted Dr. Barry Taff, a veteran paranormal investigator. Taff brought a camera crew to capture the activity. During an initial walkthrough, a skeptical cameraman, Jeff Wheatcraft, ventured into the attic. An unseen force snatched the camera from around his neck, causing him to flee in panic. When he returned with another cameraman, they found the camera's lens and body separated and placed in different corners of the room. The haunting continued, and in September 1989, Dr. Taff and Jeff returned to the house due to increased activity. As they wrapped up their investigation, Jeff was pulled back into the attic by an unseen force. Gary, another photographer, found Jeff hanging by the neck from a clothesline. Dr. Taff immediately rushed to cut him down, saving him from serious harm. This incident was the final proof that the house was dangerous. Jackie fled with her children, eventually moving into a trailer outside of town. Dr. Taff, on the other hand, continued his investigation, claiming to have contacted the spirit through a Ouija board. He believed the ghost was a man named Henderson, murdered at the nearby docks. The spirit held a particular hatred for Jeff Wheatcraft, who resembled his murderer. Even after moving, Jackie and her children were not free from the haunting. The spirit seemed sort of attached to Jackie, with incidents like a mysterious black mass appearing before her daughter Samantha's bedspread caught fire. Many believed that the spirit was not tied to the house, but to Jackie herself, possibly drawn by the stress and chaos in her life. The Lonely Child. In 1979, in Grant, New England, the Brier family experienced numerous unexplained phenomena that were later documented by William Roll of the Psychical Research Foundation and recounted in Andrew Mackenzie's book, The Seen and the Unseen. The disturbances centered around the frequent appearance of a small boy dressed in white, thought to be the ghost of a relative who had died in childhood about 50 years earlier. The first reported sighting occurred on March 9, 1981, when Mrs. Brier, home alone with her two children from a previous marriage, saw what she initially thought was her son outside her bedroom door. After confirming her son was asleep, the figure reappeared, and she observed that it resembled a boy of about 8 or 9 years old, dressed entirely in white. Over the next 2 hours, she watched as it moved back and forth along the hallway. Remarkably, she reported feeling an atmosphere of peace rather than fear during this encounter. The apparition made its presence known again on March 20th. On this specific occasion, Mrs. Brier heard the spectral boy speak, uttering phrases like, "Where do all the lonely people go?" and "Where do I belong?" which suggested his experience of isolation or displacement. The encounters escalated in clarity on March 23rd when Mr. Brier also observed the ghost in their bedroom. This time, the ghost communicated more directly, indicating that a lie had been told and that it was time for the truth to be revealed. The apparition continued to manifest in the hallway, engaging in the same pacing behavior before it finally vanished. And in another instance, Mrs. Breeny's daughter, Daisy, 11 years old at the time, encountered the figure in the hallway. Overwhelmed by fear, she and her mother sought refuge under the bed covers. This episode led to speculation that the ghost could be the spirit of Mr. Breeny's uncle, who had died at the age of 8. Although Mr. Breeny's father could not recall the specific attire his brother had been buried in, a neighbor suggested that the boy was buried in his white communion suit, corroborating the ghost's appearance. The family also experienced physical interactions with the apparition. On one occasion, the ghost appeared to kneel and attempt to lift the hallway rug. Mr. Brier, interpreting this action as a search, removed the rug and floorboard underneath, where he discovered a small metal medallion. The placement and age of the medallion, however, suggested it was unlikely to have belonged to the young boy. And something interesting to add is communications from the apparition suggested unresolved familial tensions, particularly involving a twin brother accused of removing something significant from the home. This narrative was compounded by incidents of telephone interference, a phenomenon noted in other paranormal investigations, which occurred when the family attempted to discuss the ghostly visits over the phone, leading to the line cutting out whenever the young boy's name was mentioned. Poltergeist activity was also frequent and varied, from telephones flying across rooms to doors slamming without human intervention. The family initially ignored these manifestations on the advice of the religious community, which also seemed to intensify the occurrences. The culmination of these incidents led to a comprehensive investigation by William Roll, who suggested that the intense family stress might have unconsciously generated some of the phenomena. After a series of disturbing encounters and a significant amount of poltergeist activity, which eventually subsided, possibly due to an exorcism or the natural decline of such disturbances, the family continued to live in the house, but with a newfound understanding of their experiences. The Angel over Greensburg. The residents of Greensburg, Kansas experienced an unusual event after a snowstorm. A dazzling white image appeared in the sky, causing some disturbance among the townspeople. They eventually concluded that what they were witnessing was a heavenly angel. One man, determined to document the phenomenon, grabbed his camera and took a photograph of the sky. Dark clouds had obscured the sun, casting a gloomy atmosphere over Greensburg. However, another source of light soon became apparent. According to the Fulton County News, this new light was brighter than the brightest of calcium lights and resembled a large image of a classical angel. While many residents believed it to be an angel, there were differing interpretations. One young man, whose mother had recently passed away, interpreted the apparition as his mother's spirit watching over the city. The primary source for this account, an article in the Fulton County News, described how an enterprising photographer captured the strange apparition. J. Frank Martin later sent this photograph to Mr. and Mrs. P.P. Shives, who ensured that the image was printed in the local paper. The photograph served as proof of the city's heavenly visitation, although the initial newspaper article did not include the photo itself. The identity of the original photographer remains unclear, as does the exact newspaper in which the picture first appeared. The Fulton County News confirmed the existence of the photo but did not show it. However, a scan of the photograph exists, providing tangible evidence of the event. This story was traced back to a scanned copy of the Fulton County News issue published on January 11, 1917. The first reference to the event in the photograph was found on a website dedicated to documenting paranormal occurrences. The Devil and Mr. Strichter. In the early morning of August 23, 1928, a strange and terrifying incident occurred at a rooming house in Chester, Pennsylvania, owned by Mrs. Mary Strichter. Mrs. Andrew Turk, a tenant in the house, was asleep in her room when she was suddenly awakened by disturbing noise. The source of this disturbance was a creature she later described as being about 3 feet wide with a bright red body and 2 horns on its head. It was said to also make some sort of continuous buzzing sound. The creature's appearance and noise suggested it might have been some kind of giant insect, but its devilish features hinted at something more sinister. Upon seeing the creature, Mrs. Turk screamed, waking her husband. He quickly spotted the creature hiding behind a curtain. Acting swiftly, he grabbed a chair and knocked the strange entity to the ground. With the help of other tenants, they managed to wrap the creature in a rug and throw it out of a window, effectively expelling it from the house. As news of the event spread, the neighbors began to talk. They claimed the house was haunted, linking the incident to the building's previous occupant, an old woman who had kept many of the rooms locked and barred. This old woman's behavior, once seen as mere paranoia, now seemed like a possible attempt to contain a restless spirit or some other malevolent force. The rumors intensified when it was suggested that one of the previously locked doors potentially releasing the entity that terrorized the Turks. Avian Invasion, the Fernville Incident. Fernville is a small town in the Somerset region of southeast Queensland, Australia. In 1927, this town experienced a lot of unusual and unexplained events, often referred to as the Fernville Incident. The population at the time was much lower than the estimated 3,000 residents it had in 2016. The incident began with strange lights appearing in the sky above a farm, where a 10-year-old boy lived with his family. The lights seemed to be dancing, interesting the witnesses, but soon caused distress among the farm's cattle. Several cows died under mysterious circumstances, and 2 pigs were found dead with puncture marks on their necks and bodies. Initially, the boy's parents dismissed his reports of odd noises outside the house as imagination. However, they soon heard the same noises themselves. The family began to lock their doors and windows, but one morning found both doors open with footprints resembling Wellington boot tread across the floor. The strangeness escalated when the boy and his sibling saw a brightly lit flying object move through the valley. It illuminated the whole area and seemed to follow the landscape's contours, eventually landing on a hill. The next day, they found a 9-meter diameter circle of scorched grass at the landing site. The situation grew even more bizarre though when the boys saw a giant bird perched in a tree. Even neighbors reported seeing the same creature, describing it as emitting a poultry smell and leaving feathers behind. This bird was estimated to be 3 or 4 times larger than the local wedge-tailed eagle, making it about 9 feet tall. One neighbor's son even claimed to have seen 2 of these birds gliding with their enormous wings, seemingly communicating with each other. The boy's father and sister also saw one of these birds, describing it as hopping down a hill while flapping its wings. The climax of the events, though, occurred when the boy encountered a humanoid figure dressed in a white suit. This figure, equipped with boots similar to those made by the mysterious footprints, vanished before any interaction could take place. After this encounter, the strange phenomena ceased altogether. Tier 3. The house that wasn't there. Will, who has worked various jobs including over 10 years in the army as a prison guard and in sales, shared an unusual experience he had in Blair County, PA in 2008. At the time, he was selling burial plots for a cemetery in the Altoona area. The cemetery often sent out mailers advertising their services, which generated numerous inquiries, especially from older individuals. One such call came from a woman named Tilly LaRoux, who requested more information be brought to her home. Will was assigned to visit her. The next day, Will drove out to Tilly's residence, which was a small farmhouse in the country, about half an hour away. The property was well maintained, with a freshly mowed lawn, flower beds, and a vegetable patch. Chickens roamed freely in the yard. Upon arrival, Will was greeted by Tilly, an elderly but lively woman who invited him inside for tea and homemade biscuits before discussing cemetery services. Will proceeded to explain the various burial options, including scenic plots under maple trees near a pond and next to a field of timothy grass. Tilly expressed interest in a single crypt mausoleum, an option rarely chosen because of its high cost. However, despite his doubts about her ability to afford it, Will provided the price. To his surprise, Tilly accepted and retrieved a coffee can from her cupboard, which contained old bills covered in a black residue resembling soot or creosote. She assured Will the money was real and he accepted the payment, agreeing to have the contract sent to her. 3 weeks later, Will's supervisor informed him that Tilly had not signed or returned the contract. Attempts to reach her by phone revealed that the number had been disconnected. Determined to complete the paperwork, Will offered to take another copy of the contract to her house. However, upon returning to the address, he found no trace of Tilly's house. The property was overgrown with weeds and wild grass, as if it had been abandoned for decades. Confused, Will walked further onto the land and discovered the remains of a stone foundation, covered in the same black residue found on the money. As he tried to make sense of the situation, an Amish teenager appeared on the road and warned him that he shouldn't be there. Will, not wanting to seem irrational, claimed to be from the county assessment office. The teenager explained that the land had been in its current state for as long as he could remember, referring to it as spoiled. He then pointed out the family's farm down the road and left after offering help. Will explored further and found the collapsed remains of the barn, confirming he was at the correct location. The property had clearly been abandoned for a long time, contradicting his recent visit with Tilly. Despite this though, the money she had given was kept for 6 months before being turned over to the state as unclaimed property due to the unsigned contracts. Occasionally, Will still revisits the area, hoping to find the farmhouse standing again. Each visit, he's met with the same overgrown field and foundation stones. Sometimes he thinks he can smell fresh biscuits, though he attributes it to his imagination. Despite the strangeness of the encounter though, Will remains hopeful that one day he will find the house and get answers to the many questions that linger from his experience with Tilly. The Man with No Eyes. So this story comes from someone who lived in an old house with a troubling reputation. The creepy nature of the home was evident from the start, with minor disturbances like keys moving from their places and creaky floorboards making themselves known. However, one particular night, the disturbances escalated into something far more disturbing. After working late, the parents returned home and relieved the babysitter. They then went into their daughter's room to tuck her in. The child was sound asleep, and the parent, content that everything was alright, headed to the bathroom for a shower before bed. While in the shower, a scratching noise began, reminiscent of branches scraping against a window. The bathroom, however, had no windows. Concerned, the parent opened the shower door and looked around, expecting to find their daughter up or causing the noise. Seeing nothing out of place, they decided to turn off the water, get out of the shower, and investigate further. Dressing quickly, the parent heard the scratching noise again, this time coming from the hallway. They hurried out of the bedroom only to find the hallway empty. Confused and increasingly rattled, the parent was unsure of the source of the noise, as it was unlike anything they had ever heard before in the house. Feeling uneasy, the parent decided to check on their daughter once more, fearing a possible intruder. They then found the child tucked in her bed, whimpering. The parent repeatedly asked what was wrong, but the child only stared at a corner of the room near the ceiling with her eyes filled with terror, darting between the corner and her parent. The parent sat on the bed, took the child into their arms, and began to comfort her, rocking her gently and running their fingers through her hair. Trying to calm her, they said, "Did you have a nightmare, honey?" The child then pointed towards the ceiling and said, "Don't you see the man with no eyes right there, mommy?" The parent's heart immediately raced. The room was dimly lit by a nightlight, and they had not turned on any additional lights. Determined to protect their child, the parent slowly turned their head in the direction indicated by the child's trembling finger. They didn't see a man with no eyes, but there was a black mist near the ceiling. Feeling a surge of protective instinct, the parent scooped the child up and carried her to their own bedroom. They locked the door, hoping it would offer some semblance of security against whatever had disturbed their daughter. That night, they both slept in the parents' room, despite knowing that locking the door would not necessarily keep out a spirit. In the years that followed, the child frequently spoke of the man with no eyes. According to her, he didn't harm her, but merely stared at her during the night. Sometimes he appeared on the ceiling, and other times he was in her closet, his presence a constant source of fear for her. The crash that didn't happen. This account describes a series of strange and unexplained encounters that took place in El Paso, Texas. The narrator had been living there for a few months and often smoked cigarettes outside in the backyard, which had a typical Texas style with stone walls around the border and an open natural desert beyond, offering a view of the Mexican border. The narrator was familiar with the usual sky activity like Border Patrol helicopters and satellites, and had noted that no planes typically flew over the residential area. One night though, around midnight, while outside alone, the narrator saw strange lights coming in low as if preparing to land. This sight was unusual enough that the narrator knocked on the sliding glass door and motioned for their companion to come out and see. By the time the companion reached the door, the narrator realized it was a commercial airplane with blinking lights. The companion went back inside, and the narrator continued to watch the plane approach. As the plane came even closer, it appeared to be very low, about 20 houses away. He was immediately alarmed, thinking it might crash into the houses. The plane flew directly overhead, so low that the narrator could see the landing gear and details of the welded metal. Despite not wearing glasses, he could make out the details clearly though, suggesting that the plane was no more than 300 feet above. Expecting a loud noise, he braced for impact, thinking the plane's proximity would result in an overwhelming sound. However, as the plane passed overhead, there was complete silence. There was no noise, no breeze, nothing at all. He waited, thinking the sound might be delayed, but no noise ever came. Initially, he was more concerned about the apparent crash and feared the plane had maybe lost its engine and would crash nearby. There was no airport or runway in the direction the plane was heading, and the El Paso airport was in the opposite direction. Despite the expectation of a crash, there was still no sound of an impact, no sign of the plane gaining altitude, and no trace of it anywhere. 2 nights later, the same phenomenon occurred again. This time, everyone else was asleep inside. The narrator saw the same type of lights coming from the horizon, following the same path as before. The plane lowered until it was directly above the houses, just a few hundred feet up, and once again, there was no sound. The narrator braced for the noise again, but again it never came. Realizing the 2 planes could not crash in the same path without any evidence, he concluded that something very unusual was happening. There was no news coverage or any indication that others had seen the planes. Despite checking, he found no reports of plane crashes or any sort of unusual activity. The planes simply seemed to vanish without a trace, leaving no evidence of their presence. Stepped into another reality. At the end of a work shift, a person was heading out to meet their roommate who worked on a different floor in the same building. As they exited, they saw their roommate and a mutual friend about 10 meters ahead, walking through the main entrance. Jokingly thinking their roommate was not waiting for them, they followed, expecting to catch up soon. Turning the corner, they anticipated seeing the 2 on the walkway toward the car, but no one was there. Puzzled, they continued to the car, knowing it would take about 100 meters of walking, crossing a road, and another 20 meters behind a fence to reach it. Upon arrival though, the car was completely empty. After waiting a few minutes, they received a call from the roommate asking where they were, claiming to be waiting inside the building. The caller insisted they had not left the building and were still in the hall. Thinking that it might have just been a prank, the person confronted their roommate and friend when they arrived at the car. The roommate and friend denied leaving the building and insisted they had been waiting in the hall. The person tried to rationalize the event, noting that their roommate's clothing was common and perhaps they had mistaken someone else for their roommate and friend. However, the person distinctly remembered the other individual dressed similarly to their friend. But the roommate insisted that they'd been waiting in the hall, planning to use the bathroom while the first person to arrive waited for the other. Despite this, neither the person nor the friends had seen each other in the hall, and none of them were known for being distracted by their phones. 6 months later, the story still remains the same, and if it was a joke, the friends have maintained it convincingly. The incident has become sort of an inside joke among them, suggesting the person unknowingly jumps between dimensions. Whenever there's a misunderstanding, they jokingly blame the person's supposed dimensional drifting tendency. Despite attempts to find a logical explanation, the person still remains convinced that they saw their friends exit the building. Even if mistaken, the friend would have intercepted them, so it is sort of weird. Transported to another reality. This account describes a disturbing experience of distorted reality. It all started when the person was walking to a friend's house, a guitarist in the band, to write new songs. The route was familiar, which was a street they had walked many times. While on their way, they noticed 2 ladies with baby carriages approaching from the opposite side on the same sidewalk. Initially, everything seemed normal, but as they got closer, something seemed off. Both ladies had short blonde hair of the same length and blank faces, showing no expression. One of the carriages held a crying baby, but the ladies walked silently. Their synchronized steps seemed robotic, and as the person passed them, the ladies suddenly froze. In that moment, the world changed. Everything lost color, turning monochrome like an old TV. Every entity on the street froze in place, including a car mid-air above a speed bump. The person tried to take pictures with their smartphone, but it wouldn't turn on, despite being fully charged minutes earlier. Confused and scared, they crossed the street to explore this frozen world. Everything, even the clouds, was simply motionless. An inexplicable urge directed them back to the original sidewalk to touch one of the ladies' arms. When they did, she reacted, pushing the hand away and speaking, breaking the frozen silence. At that moment, everything returned to normal. The baby cried again, colors came back, and everyone resumed their movements. The time on the person's phone still showed 12:32 p.m., as if no time had passed, though they felt they had been in the other reality for 5 to 10 minutes. One more detail stood out, being that the lady's hand was ice cold, unnaturally so, like something that had been in a freezer for hours. The experience left the person completely confused and unable to explain what happened, suspecting that the ladies might have been otherworldly beings or robots. This occurred about a month or two before they shared their story, and the memory still remains vivid and unexplained. Haunted Hospital Patrol. A long time ago, a woman working security was sent in to fill for someone at an old hospital no longer in operation. This building was primarily used for filming, and security was hired to prevent squatters, vagrants, and vandals from entering. On her arrival, the guard she was relieving showed her the ropes and mentioned there would be a backup guard stationed in the lobby. This backup guard, who she referred to as Scarecrow, was unresponsive, sitting with the mini TV on his lap and earphones in, seemingly oblivious to the surroundings. As she began her patrol, she noticed an eerie silence throughout the building. The place appeared as if it'd been a lively hospital moments before, but everyone had suddenly vanished. Books and file folders were scattered, phones were off the hook, and medical instruments were left out. The scene resembled a sudden disappearance, like something from the Twilight Zone or the Christian notion of the rapture. And while patrolling the hallways, she occasionally glimpsed figures out of the corner of her eye. One such figure was an old man in a hospital gown with what looked like a monitor or IV on wheels. This figure seemed to float through the hall as only the torso was visible while the rest was obscured by the hallway. Despite seeing these figures peripherally, whenever she turned to look directly at them, they would disappear. These sightings continued throughout her shift, and she often kept seeing people, but again they would vanish as soon as she tried to focus on them. Also, cold spots seemed to form in various parts of the building. These spots were said to start in small areas and then keep on expanding. The experience left her feeling really uneasy, and the combination of seeing these ghostly figures and the strange cold spots created what she believed was a paranormal environment. Despite being alone in the building, except for the unresponsive Scarecrow in the lobby, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched and surrounded by these unseen presences. Dear Ghost. Julie Hafford shared an experience that took place on the night of November 16, 2017. Julie and her daughter were returning home from a birthday party in northern Maine. The roads in this area are pretty rural, and animal collisions are common. Julie, having driven these roads for 25 years, was always very attentive while driving at night. As they were driving, a large buck suddenly appeared in the middle of the road. Julie saw the deer and immediately slammed on the brakes, veering to the right. The deer turned left, and Julie's car hit the buck on the driver's side headlight. She heard the crunch of metal and saw the deer sprawling across the road. Her daughter also heard the bang and asked what had happened. Julie replied, "I think I hit a deer." She then pulled over to the side of the road, turned on the hazard lights, and composed herself. She was confused because no other cars were stopping or slowing down, which was really unusual in their area. Normally, when someone hits an animal, many drivers would stop to check on the situation. Julie then got out to inspect the damage to her car and called the game wardens. To her surprise, there was completely no damage to her car. The headlights and fender were intact, with no hair, blood, or any sign of the deer. When the police and game wardens arrived, Julie explained what happened. The police checked her car and the wardens searched for the deer. They found no sign of the animal. Given the impact, the deer should have been injured, but there was no trace of it anywhere. Julie simply kept insisting that she had hit a deer, and she heard the metal crunch and saw the deer fly past her window. She even used a spotlight to search the ditches, bushes, and fields, but found nothing. Her daughter also insisted that she saw and heard the deer. She asked the police if the deer was okay and told one of the wardens to make sure it wasn't her in the bushes. The wardens reassured her that there were no animals in the road. Julie, though, was certain it wasn't just her imagination. Something to note too is the first car that passed them after the incident arrived less than a minute later. There was no time for the deer to have crawled away, and there should have been some damage to the car if they had indeed hit it. The car N05 with the plastic front bumper would have shown at least some scratches. Julie was left bewildered by the encounter. She had never experienced anything like this in all her years of driving. She knew that she was lucky it wasn't worse, as she had seen accidents involving deer and moose that resulted in severe injuries or fatalities. Yet the lack of evidence of the collision left her questioning what had really happened that night. Draw the witch's blood. An article from the New Oxford PA item on March 11, 1915 recounts an unusual incident in Pottsville, Pennsylvania. Mrs. Michelina Zemanowski accused Mrs. Kate Short of being a witch. This accusation came during a trial where Mrs. Zemanowski was charged with attacking and clawing Mrs. Short. The courtroom was filled with onlookers who whispered among themselves as Mrs. Zemanowski made her claim. The conflict between the two women began nearly a year earlier when Mrs. Short sold some tallow dips to Mrs. Zemanowski. During the transaction, Mrs. Short invited her to have a drink of whiskey, which was accepted. Shortly after, Mrs. Zemanowski's voice began to fail. Instead of attributing this to a cold or a disease, she believed it was witchcraft. As time passed, she became more convinced that she was under a witch's spell, causing her significant distress. Her belief led to sleepless nights and frantic days. The sight of Mrs. Short made her hysterical, prompting discussions with her husband and neighbors, and they concluded that the only way to break the spell was to draw the witch's blood. One Sunday morning in the village of Turkey Run, Mrs. Zemanowski attacked Mrs. Short on the street, scratching her until blood ran down her cheeks. Mrs. Short had her arrested, but she claimed she acted under her husband's orders. According to Pennsylvania law at the time, a wife is considered coerced when ordered by her husband to commit an unlawful act, so she was discharged and her husband was fined as a culpable assailant. The belief in witchcraft was not isolated to this incident. Nearby farmers had also recently hunted at night armed with rifles loaded with golden bullets to kill a black hex cat reportedly set upon a young woman by an enemy. In another town, a seamstress was stoned out of town as a witch because the baby of the family with whom she boarded cried frequently. A woman owning a black cat and a white dog was also accused of witchcraft by a neighbor whose child had died. Lamberhurst's Ghost. In the Kent and Sussex Courier, an article from June 1, 1906 detailed strange events occurring in the village of Lamberhurst, Kent. Villagers believed they were dealing with a mysterious and active ghost. The area, which was a cluster of Elizabethan cottages, seemed an appropriate setting for such occurrences. The center of these events was Furnace Mill, owned by Mr. J.C. Playfoot, a farmer and hop grower. Furnace Mill, located in a wooded hollow and flanked by Dark Lake, was an isolated place. The only sounds were a cascade and bird calls, and Mr. Playfoot, a practical man, was initially reluctant to discuss his experiences but felt compelled to do so when a Daily Mail reporter visited. Playfoot explained that despite strict security measures, doors in the mill would unlock and open on their own, and horses would move between stables without explanation. Playfoot described several incidents. First, doors would swing open, horses would be moved or turned around in their stalls, and bales of hay would be scattered. In one instance, barrels of lime were thrown downstairs, even though the rooms were locked and the keys were in his pocket. No one ever saw or heard anything unusual. But it was Thea Playfoot that really recounted a strange event. One afternoon, after locking all the buildings, he heard his son's startled cry. Rushing out, he saw the drawing room door open, then close. The door locked itself and his son was trapped inside. Despite holding the key, he found his son alone and frightened when he unlocked the door. Young Playfoot, a 15-year-old, confirmed the story as well. He said that his door closed mysteriously without any sound from the latch or lock, even though he was very close to it. And another incident involved a large water butt being overturned. While working near the stables, Playfoot found a lock removed and then neatly restored without any sign of how it happened. He reported seeing and hearing nothing during these events. Playfoot took the reporter to a stable secured by unique fastening he had designed. Inside was a gray mare, and Playfoot had decided to watch the stable closely due to previous strange occurrences. Despite locking everything securely, he found the horse in an adjoining hay room which was padlocked. The horse had somehow moved through a narrow door and up steps without explanation. Playfoot was certain that no human could have done this without detection, as he was only a few yards away. The police also investigated but found no explanation. They were just as baffled as Mr. Playfoot. The events caused concern among the local residents of Lamberhurst, Horsmondon, and Gondurst, who hoped the disturbances would remain confined to Furnace Mill. I tell you, that place is haunted. The following story, published in the Philadelphia Public Ledger on October 31st, 1916, describes an experience that led two families to leave their home in haste. Frank Ramagano and Salvatore Pascal, along with their wives, had been living at 2008 South 15th Street for 3 weeks when they decided to move out suddenly. The decision came after enduring nightly visits from a ghostly figure. The specter was said to appear around 2 a.m., resembling a corpse with long hair and glassy eyes. The figure would stare at its reflection in the mirror with a sardonic grin, twisting its thin bluish lips. When someone turned on the gaslight, the apparition would fade away with a rattling cough that echoed through the bedroom. This ongoing presence of the visitor took a deep toll on Mrs. Ramagano and Mrs. Pascal. They couldn't endure the strain any longer and insisted that they move. By 7 a.m. on the day they decided to leave, 2 morning vans were at the front door, and the families began packing their belongings. Neighbors expressed little surprise at their departure though. They claimed no one stayed at the address for long because the house had been haunted since a young man died there from tuberculosis several years earlier. Emmanuel C. Kolb, the agent in charge of the property, acknowledged that 2 previous families had left without explanation. However, he mentioned another family had lived there for years without reporting any ghostly encounters. Mrs. Pascal recounted her experience while movers loaded her belongings into a van. She expressed relief at leaving, explaining how both she and her sister had become nervous wrecks from their nightly encounters with the ghost. On the first night in the house, Mrs. Pascal woke up feeling chilly and saw the ghostly figure standing by the dresser. Paralyzed with fear, it took her 10 minutes to muster the courage to nudge her husband awake. He too saw the apparition and jumped out of bed to light the gas. The ghost vanished with a cough. The Pascals stayed up for the rest of the night, discovering that the Ramaganos had experienced the same sighting. This nightly occurrence continued, with the ghost appearing at the same time, and sometimes they heard it moving around during the day. Mrs. Pascal often heard a rattling cough from the upper part of the house while she worked in the kitchen. She would knock on the wall and the ghost would respond with mocking laughter. The sound of dragging feet in the upper hallway also became common. As Halloween approached, the ghost's appearances increased in frequency. Fearing what might happen on Halloween night in specific, the families decided they couldn't stay in the house for any longer. Mr. Kolb, upon hearing these ghost stories, sent an inspector to the property. When the man opened the cellar door, a black cat darted through the kitchen and out of the house, causing Mrs. Pascal to nearly have a hysterical episode. She questioned how a cat could have entered the cellar with all the windows locked tight. The appearance of the cat startled the entire neighborhood, reinforcing their belief that the house was haunted. A neighbor even remarked that she wasn't surprised, insisting that the place was indeed haunted. Tier 4. Talking to Time Travelers. In eastern Kentucky, a young boy named Ben, then about 15 years old, experienced a strange event while walking near his home. The area, known for its haunted reputation, was a familiar place for Ben, who often drove dirt bikes and 4-wheelers along the dirt road by the neighborhood. One day, without gas for his dirt bike, Ben decided to take a walk, carrying a machete to protect himself from snakes and to look for deer. As he walked along the straight stretch of road spanning about 300 to 300 yards, he suddenly noticed 2 men standing about 20 feet in front of him. Startled by their sudden appearance, he remarked that they had scared him. One of the men apologized, and they approached Ben asking how he had gone there. Ben explained that he lived only half a mile away, but the men seemed confused and asked how he had gone past the gates. Ben informed them that there was no gate, explaining that a gate had been there years ago but had been removed. This dirt road, stretching for miles in both directions, had no other gates. Reflecting on it, the men's questions seemed strange, especially since they were coming from the direction of Ben's house, the only entrance and exit for miles. Ben wondered why they didn't know there wasn't a gate. During the conversation, Ben grew increasingly uneasy. The men maintained direct eye contact with him the whole time, ignoring his gestures towards his house and his explanation about the machete. Only one of the men spoke, but both stared intently into Ben's eyes. Feeling increasingly creeped out and unsure of what to do, Ben decided to walk back towards his house. As he walked away, he turned around after a few steps and saw that the men had vanished. This disappearance didn't make sense as there was nowhere for them to hide along the straight stretch of road. Ben's nervousness escalated into panic. His heart started racing, he started walking faster, frequently looking back to see if the men had reappeared. They were gone though, leaving no trace behind. Ben then reached the main road and saw no signs of any vehicles or work trucks. He realized that it was best to hurry home since he felt an intense sense of danger. Upon reaching home, he slammed the door shut, locked it, and told his mother about the encounter, convinced that the two men were trying to kill him. This account was shared on Art Bell Dark Matter on October 31st, 2013, and still remains an unexplained event in Ben's life. Creepy kids roaming at night. On the night of November 1st, 2014, in Minneapolis, Minnesota, Mary had an experience during her paper route that left her creeped out. She recounted her story to Coast and Darkness Radio, seeking answers for the unexplained event. That night, Marie was delivering newspapers as usual. It was around 4:30 in the morning when she rounded a curve and saw a group of kids standing in the middle of the road. There were about 6 of them, all wearing gray robes with hoods. The hoods were down their backs, which struck Marie as odd since Halloween had ended about 10 hours earlier. One of the kids, a girl around 15 years old, saw Marie and started walking quickly towards her. She was saying something indistinguishable, and Marie wondered why the girl was out at the time of night. With no time to engage, she drove around her, only to find 5 other kids blocking the road. They fanned out to surround her car, preventing her from moving at all. In an attempt to escape, Marie drove up onto the lawn, narrowly avoiding hitting one of the kids. She considered calling the police, thinking the situation was really unusual, but instead she decided to follow them to gather more information for the police. The kids turned down a street and Marie followed them, and it took her about 10 seconds to reach the street, but when she did, the kids were gone. They disappeared, but there was no way they could have reached even the nearest house in that short time. The event that night was unlike anything Marie had ever encountered. The sight of the kids in gray robes, their sudden appearance and disappearance, and the eerie timing just after Halloween added to the mystery. Rail Yard Incident. Many years ago, in a rail yard in Des Moines, a tragic event occurred that caused some carmen to quit their jobs and seek employment in other industries. One night, a carman made a fatal mistake due to a moment of carelessness. He attempted to cross the track on foot in front of a set of train cars. It was a cold and rainy night, and train cars are almost silent on wet rails. He didn't notice the cars being pushed onto the track he was trying to cross. As he stepped in front of the moving cars, they coupled into his lower abdomen, crushing him between the couplers. Another carman, noticing his absence, found him still alive, though trapped. The couplers were the only thing keeping him alive, and as soon as the cars were separated, he would die. At the insistence of the other carman, his wife was brought to the rail yard to say goodbye. The injured carman held his hands with his wife and his best friend as the train was slowly pulled apart. As the train cars were separated, he just fell asleep, as quoted, and those present wept for their fallen comrade. Even though he had passed away, his presence seemed to linger in the rail yard, seemingly to protect his friends and colleagues. In the area where the accident happened, several strange occurrences also were reported. A few months after the accident, a night shift carman was crossing the track in front of a set of cars when he felt something grab his collar, pull him back, and throw him onto the ground. However, the thing was, there was no one there. This event puzzled and frightened the carman, who could not explain what happened. Several months later, a unit train heading to Kansas City was preparing to enter the yard from the east and was slowing down for the east yard switch. The engineer used the radio to identify the train, and the yardmaster replied that a carman was at the east switch and had lined up for the train for track 6. The engineer acknowledged the message, throttled the train, and eased it into the yard. About halfway into the yard, the engineer noticed a blue lantern in the middle of the track at a slight curve. He set the air throttle down to a stop and notified the yardmaster on the radio that he saw blue light on track 6 and could not proceed. The rear of the train blocked the east yard switch, halting all operations. A carman from the west side of the yard then drove over to investigate, knowing that he and other carmen had just aligned the switches for the train. When he arrived, he too found a glowing blue lantern placed next to a broken rail. The blue lantern is a signal used only by carmen, and all other railroad employees must yield to it. The lantern's presence next to the broken rail, which could have derailed the locomotives, was a warning. The location was where the fatal accident had occurred, and the real men believed it was their fallen brother giving them a warning. Over time, the unexplained events began to fade. The responsibility of retelling the stories fell to retired carmen, who remembered the days of their youth filled with storms, floods, hobos, and their fallen friend. They believed he continued to watch over them, ensuring their safety. Ghost of Miss Beswick. In the 18th century, Miss Beswick lived in a manor house at Birch and Bower, Hollinwood, now part of Greater Manchester. Her home was surrounded by woods and fields, and her property included Rose Hill and Cheatwood. After her death, most of the manor house was demolished. Known for eccentricity, Miss Beswick farmed her land until she was too old to do so. During the Jacobite Rebellion of 1745, she feared the Scottish army, led by Prince Charles, would seize the fortune of landowners. Like many wealthy landowners, she hid her treasures around her estates in secret locations. Although the rebellion did not reach her land, she never retrieved her hidden valuables. Later in life, Miss Beswick experienced a shocking event. She believed that her brother had died, as did the doctor who declared him dead. However, just as the coffin lid was being screwed down, she noticed signs of life in her brother. The undertaker stopped and her brother was taken back to bed. He remained in a coma for a few days before recovering and living for many more years. This experience left Miss Beswick deeply affected, influencing the unusual provisions in her will. Fearing being buried alive, she left her estates to her family doctor, Dr. White, and his descendants on the condition that her body would always be kept above ground. Also, her will stipulated that every 21 years, her body should be returned to Birch and Bower for a week. After her death around 1768, Dr. White arranged for her body to be wrapped in bandages with only the face exposed and embalmed in tar. Her body was then displayed at the Natural History Museum and later at the Manchester Museum for a century. On July 22, 1868, the Manchester Guardian reported that the Manchester Natural History Society deemed her body undesirable, and she was finally laid to rest in Harper Hayes Cemetery. Local villagers claimed that her wish for her body to be returned to Birch and Bower every 21 years was honored. Her body was then placed in the granary of the old farmstead 5 times. But on the ghost aspect, after her death, her ghost was frequently seen by villagers. When the manor house was divided into separate dwellings, people saw her ghost while having supper. Her presence was usually preceded by the rustling of her silk dress before she appeared, dressed in black, gliding through the kitchen and disappearing at the same flagstone. And her ghost was last seen in 1920 near a well by the stone cottage where she had moved when she became too frail to live in the manor. A villager fetching water saw a lady dressed in black silk with a white cap, standing in a hostile and threatening manner. Also, the barn on her property was said to glow as if on fire, with light shining through its cracks, accompanied by eerie noises. People always avoided the barn, but whenever it was checked after such incidents, there were no signs of fire. It was believed that this barn was the hiding place of Miss Beswick's treasure. Although a local man named Joe found a box of gold wedges that brought him some wealth, most of the treasure was never found. A freaky field trip. In March 2009, a student named Josh experienced something strange during a school trip to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The trip was meant to be an educational experience for his 9th grade class, focusing on the historical significance of Gettysburg. Josh wasn't excited about the trip at first because he didn't care much for history or museums, but his perspective changed when he found the information presented in an engaging way. On the first day, the class toured the battlefields, and that night they stayed in a hotel. The following day, they explored the town of Gettysburg, focusing on war-related sites. One of the stops was the Hall of Presidents, where they had wax figures of all the presidents and their wives. Josh found these figures creepy, but what happened next was even more disturbing. During the visit, Josh needed to use the restroom and separated from the group to find it. The building was almost empty that day, with just his class visiting. As he followed the signs to the restroom, he heard an angry whisper saying, "Mine." He quickly turned around to see who had spoken, but no one was there. Although curious, he was in a hurry and didn't spend too much time searching. In the restroom, Josh went to the sink to wash his hands. As he was soaping up, he noticed movement in the mirror. He then looked up and saw a man in a Civil War uniform standing right beside him, staring at him. The man had bushy sideburns known as mutton chops, a hat, and a rifle. Josh assumed he was a museum staff member dressed in period clothing for a reenactment. Josh told the man he would be done in a second and rinsed his hands off, expecting the man to use the sink next. After drying his hands, Josh stepped aside, but when he looked for the man, he was gone. He hadn't heard any footsteps or the door opening, so he figured the man must still be in the restroom. Josh checked the stalls, all of which were open except one. He squatted down to look for feet under the door but saw nothing. Confused, he reached out to push the door open, calling out to see if the man was inside. There was still no response. As he pushed the door open slowly, expecting to see the man, he suddenly heard the same angry voice shout, "Mine." This time, it was much louder and seemed to come from right next to his ear. Startled, Josh jumped and spun around, but again, no one was there. Terrified, he ran out of the restroom and back to his classmates, not stopping until he found them. Josh's friend, also named Josh, noticed how upset he was and asked what was wrong. He didn't explain in front of everyone, but later, after they left the museum, one of the adult chaperones told the group that the Hall of Presidents had actually been built over a mass grave of dead soldiers. Whether this was true or not, Josh believed the figure he saw in the restroom was the ghost of a soldier, angry about the intrusion of his resting place. Carrie's paranormal sightings. Carrie Casterwiller experienced numerous paranormal encounters since 1998 while working as a tour guide at Nemacolin Castle in Brownsville, Pennsylvania, and later at Brownsville Hospital. Initially, she was uncertain about the reality of paranormal activities, but that changed when she was 19. While leading one of her early tours at Nemacolin Castle, she saw 3 dead soldiers hanging from the ceiling in the meat and cheese cellar for the maids. Despite being shocked, she maintained her composure to avoid alarming the tour group. Soon after, Carrie had another encounter during a tour. She saw 3 full-bodied apparitions, including a woman in a full Victorian dress in the main room, standing right outside of her closet. Carrie, who was standing at the top of the steps, saw the woman, but the tour group couldn't see into the closet. When a group member asked if she was okay after noticing her reaction, Carrie downplayed the situation by claiming there was a mannequin inside. Carrie also saw the ghost of a lady at the top of the stairs in a round room of the castle. The ghost, wearing a black Victorian dress, had fallen down the stairs and broken her neck while alive. These encounters were disturbing, but she continued her work. A significant personal experience though happened after Carrie's grandmother had died. Her grandmother appeared to her in her room and told her something that came true the next day. This incident had a profound impact on her, and she then started working at Brownsville Hospital. Over here, she also had several paranormal encounters. In one such instance, one night, after using the restroom in a closed unit, she heard footsteps behind her as she walked down the hallway at 2 a.m. Turning around, she saw a pair of yellow clogs moving by themselves, leaving footprints on the freshly waxed floor. The security guard confirmed the footprints, and during another shift, Carrie and a colleague were charting in the psych unit, which had previously been the maternity ward. Construction was underway, and they saw the apparition of an old maternity nurse. The nurse, dressed in an old-fashioned uniform, complete with a cape and hat, walked to where a big window used to be to look at the cribs. Carrie's colleague also confirmed seeing the apparition too. In the rehab unit, Carrie and another worker heard voices coming from an empty room. When they checked, they found the water running, the toilet flushing, and the lights on. They then turned everything off, but it happened again. Carrie reluctantly went back into the room alone and saw the reflection of an older, disheveled man in the mirror. But yeah, by this time, these paranormal events had become sort of a routine for Carrie. She continued her work, accepting that the supernatural occurrences were just a part of her life. A phantom monk and a flying saucer. Brian Whitehead and 3 of his friends were playing behind a school in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan one night when they saw something really unusual in the sky. It was September 19, 1963, and the children were not thinking about UFOs at all. They were just playing when they noticed an oval-shaped object circling overhead. The glowing object then descended closer to the ground, and as it approached, a small box-like structure fell from the object and hovered a few feet away from the curious children. The children cautiously moved toward the box, unsure of what it was. Suddenly, a man-shaped figure emerged from this box. The box seemed to vanish, leaving only the figure behind. It appeared to be about 10 feet tall and wore robes that resembled those of a monk. The robes were described as being white like a crayon, and Brian, one of the children, told investigators that he could sometimes see through the figure, suggesting that it was not solid. The figure made a moaning sound, stretched out its arms, and floated towards the children. This sight immediately terrified the group, causing them to run away as quickly as they could. It's reported that one of the girls in the group was so traumatized by the encounter that she needed to be hospitalized. The children's parents and the local police were taken aback by the genuine fear the children displayed and took their story seriously. There were also reports of other UFO sightings in the area at the same time. This encounter is unusual because it involves both a UFO and an apparition that looked like a medieval monk. Reports of apparition-like entities associated with UFOs are not common, and the combination of a UFO and a ghostly figure in monk-like robes is even rarer. The Exorcism of Elizabeth de Ranfang. Mary Elizabeth de Ranfang was born on October 30th, 1592 in Remiremont, Lorraine. Her parents were minor nobles who forced her into marriage with an older nobleman named Francois Dubois. This marriage was unhappy and abusive, and Dubois was an alcoholic. Elizabeth had 6 children with him before she became a widow. She then moved to the Duchy of Lorraine, which was eventually annexed and became a province of France. In 1618, she attended a social event where a doctor named Charles Pavoy proposed to her. She refused, and Pavoy then turned to occult means to win her affection. He used herbal filters in an attempt to make her fall in love with him. Instead of achieving the desired effect though, these concoctions made her seriously ill. Her condition was then identified as demonic possession by contemporary French experts. Pavoy's use of herbal mixtures severely affected her health, causing symptoms that were interpreted as signs of demonic possession. Despite being desperate to win her love, his attempts only worsened her condition. Pavoy was eventually convicted of sorcery and executed by burning. Elizabeth, now suffering from unexplained symptoms, consulted several physicians, but none could cure her. As a last resort, she underwent an exorcism on September 2nd, 1619 in Remiremont. The exorcism was performed by Claude Pithoys, a French professor and Mennonite monk who was skeptical about demonic possession. Pithoys believed that the drugs used by Pavoy were the cause of Elizabeth's convulsions. He confidently declared that if the case was genuine, he should become possessed himself. This skepticism, though, was not accepted and led to his dismissal, and a different doctor had replaced him. Elizabeth was sent to Nancy, the capital of the Duchy of Lorraine, to be examined by respected physician Remy Pichard and his colleagues. Pichard documented her case thoroughly, and he and his team concluded that her symptoms were due to demonic possession. Then, a group of exorcists, including church officials, physicians, monks, theologians, and representatives of the royal court, gathered to observe Elizabeth at a chapel on May 31, 1621. During this event, her neck swelled to an alarming size, making it seem as if her head was directly attached to her body. The witnesses, including Pichard, believed that the demon had stretched her body to make her appear taller. Her face then darkened, her eyes rolled back, and she foamed at the mouth. It's said she then fell to the ground, writhing before being lifted by an invisible force, appearing to be suspended by an imperceptible string tied to her waist. This posture inverted, leaving her waist the only part touching the ground. She then climbed a nearby column and hung by her left leg from a great height, eventually falling 7 feet to the floor without injury. Throughout these occurrences, her clothing remained intact, honoring her vow never to undress after her husband's abuse. The exorcist interrogated the demon in various languages, including Hebrew, Greek, Italian, and Latin. The demon responded fluently, sometimes using multiple languages in a single sentence. When the exorcist used incorrect Greek, the demon corrected their grammar. The demon also obeyed instructions given in different languages, performed religious gestures, and even kissed the feet of the Bishop of Toul. It demonstrated knowledge of Catholic theology and revealed the secret sins of those present. Sometimes it was said to understand even the lip movements and hand gestures, responding without spoken words. The demon also performed bizarre body movements and postures. After years of exorcisms, the possession ceased in 1625. The exorcist even signed statements affirming the validity of the possession. Elizabeth went on to found the Order of Refuge, a religious order aimed at helping women recover from lives of prostitution. Tier 5. A ghostly reader. In the 1950s, a researcher named John May uncovered a strange case near Lincoln, Lincolnshire, which he later shared with Peter Underwood, who was the president of the Ghost Club at the time. May had been asked to tidy up a garden for a new homeowner who had bought a house just outside the town. The new owner then arranged for May to live in the house while preparing the gardens and before moving in himself. On the day May moved in, a Friday, he spent the entire day working in the garden. After finishing his work, he cooked his own supper in the kitchen. Then, around 10 o'clock in the evening, he lit a candle, placing it in a candlestick holder so he could read a newspaper since there was no electricity connected yet. By 10:30, May went around the ground floor rooms, securing the windows and doors before heading upstairs to the room where he had set up a camp bed for the night. While in the drawing room, May placed the candle on the floor and looked out towards the road. Suddenly, he heard a noise behind him and turned to see the drawing room door key lying on the floor, though it had previously been in the lock. The door itself then began to close slowly. May, familiar with paranormal activity, was not really afraid. He put the key back in the lock and opened the door, only for it to slam shut again. The open sash window also slammed downwards. Undeterred, May locked up as best as he could and went back to bed. There were no further disturbances that night, but on the second night, while sitting up in bed reading with a candle on a chair next to him, May noticed the candle flame dimming and appearing to hover above the wick. Suddenly, the candle, still alight, lifted itself from the candlestick, dropped to the floor, and rolled up against the skirting board. May quickly retrieved it to prevent any damage and placed the candle back where it had been and simply got back into bed to continue reading. Shortly after laying the book down though, he noticed the pages turning slowly at first, then quite rapidly. Suddenly, all activity had ceased. The next morning, after making inquiries in the neighborhood, May speculated that the spirit might be that of an elderly lady who had once lived in the house. Known to be reclusive, she may have become attached to the house and resented intrusion by the others. May performed an exorcism and there were no further incidents. The new occupant never realized how close he came to living in a haunted house. The Gill House. Gill House, located near Broomfield in Cumberland, has a history that dates back to the early 13th century. During World War II, it served as a base for the Women's Land Army. Early on, many young women stationed there began hearing strange noises coming from one bedroom in one of the oldest parts of the house. Initially, rats were believed to be the cause, but inspections found no trace of them. The noises grew even louder and footsteps could occasionally be heard. Several girls reported feeling as though they were being choked in that room and refused to stay there. These occurrences seemed to focus on 3 nights during the wane of the moon. Mrs. Ealsby of the Women's Land Army then sent a team to investigate the claims, which included Mrs. Parkins, the vicar of Ainstable Rev Murray, and his wife. They met with Miss Mandale, the house warden, who had not experienced anything herself but was clearly concerned by the fear felt by the girls. Initially, nothing much happened during the investigation. Mrs. Murray suggested that tapping might provoke some activity, and acting on this suggestion, Mrs. Parkins gave a loud knock on the cupboard. Moments later, the knock was answered by a loud rustling sound. Suddenly, a figure of a man appeared from the cupboard, moving towards Mrs. Parkins and stopping close to her. Everyone present had heard a strange noise resembling the reeling in of a fishing reel. Mrs. Parkins also reported to feel a sudden coldness while the figure was near her. The figure then moved towards Mr. Murray and began tapping on the wall, producing a metallic sound. A dreadful smell, described as similar to that of a leaking coffin, filled the room. The figure walked around tapping for nearly 3 hours before disappearing into a cupboard on the opposite side of the room. All was then quiet and the team went downstairs. The team concluded that the room was haunted and advised that the girls should not stay there, though they didn't provide Miss Mandel with a full description of the events. Using a version of the Ouija board, the Murrays and Mrs. Parkins attempted to contact the spirits in Gill House. They seemed to connect with spirits identified as Gerald Weary and Lily, his servant. Gerald claimed to be a Jacobite from the reign of George I and confessed to have stolen sacred relics, which he had hidden in Gill House. When asked if the relics could be located at all, the questioners were informed that they had turned to dust. And in another seance, the spirits warned that the house sometimes hosted crowds of evil spirits and advised the occupants to leave it alone. A clairvoyant who visited the house shortly after these events felt the presence of two ghosts, describing them as a man wearing tight-fitting trousers and a girl. All 26 Women's Land Army girls stationed at the house requested a local clergyman to exorcise the spirits or to have the house simply closed down. To prove there was nothing to fear though, Miss Mandel and Mrs. Howe, the Cumberland County WLA organizer, declared they would stay in the haunted room during the relevant period, but they ended up not making it through the night. Before sunrise, they left the room in a disturbed state. Mrs. Howe had 3 unpleasant experiences that left her in a state of panic. She recommended that the WLA remove the girls, deeming the house unsuitable for them. The hostel was then subsequently closed. Today, Gill House is a private residence. However, the current occupier has not responded to inquiries about its condition or the possibility of further investigation into the paranormal activities that once plagued it. The Grenadier Public House. Some 170 years ago, the Guardsmen served as an officers' mess and gambling room for the Duke of Wellington's regiment in Knightsbridge, London. According to legend, a young officer was caught cheating at cards and was attacked by his fellow officers. They stripped him, flogged him, and left him to die in the cellar. Today, the Guardsman is known as the Grenadier Public House. Several landlords have reported a ghost that appears every September around the anniversary of the young soldier's death. This ghost is often described as creating an indefinable but definite atmosphere. It has affected both people and animals, and there have been several sightings. One landlord's son saw a black shape outside his bedroom one September evening. His mother also saw a figure climbing the stairs, which then just simply disappeared. A visitor to the pub also saw a figure by the side of the bed in the middle of the night, which also vanished. Another landlord, Jeffrey Bernard, reported poltergeist activity and shadows during September specifically. In January 1991, John Spencer, one of the authors of this compilation, visited the Grenadier and spoke to the manager at the time, Peter Martin, and 2 of his staff, Sarah McCartney and Katie McVie. Peter Martin shared several strange occurrences. One night around midnight, Martin was in the bar with Edward Weber, a friend of the then landlord. They saw a bottle lift from about 1 foot above the floor to head height in the middle of the bar area before it exploded. Martin also mentioned instances where keys would go missing and then reappear mysteriously. In one case in 1988 or 1989, electricians arrived to do repair work in the cellar, but the keys were missing from under Martin's mattress, where they were usually kept. The keys were eventually found but wouldn't open the lock. However, a street cleaner who was friends with the electricians managed to open it effortlessly. At the time of Spencer's visit, the street cleaner had retired and his whereabouts were unknown. Peter Martin started at the pub in January 1988 as a relief manager and became the manager in February 1990. Since then, he had not experienced any sightings. He noted that ghost activity could easily be missed. Between July and September of 1991, there was actually a break-in at the pub early in the morning. Despite several people sleeping in the building, no one heard the break-in, which was discovered by the cleaner. John Spencer then asked the staff about their views on ghosts. Peter Martin was skeptical and not inclined to believe in such things. Sarah McCartney, who had only been at the pub for about 2 weeks, had not felt any presence or seen anything unusual. She also remained skeptical. Katie McVie, who had been at the pub for about 4 months, had not seen or felt anything either. However, she admitted with a grin that she was prepared to believe in ghosts because she wanted to and found the idea pretty exciting. Man in a Homburg hat. In the early 1950s, Judy, a young girl whose father passed away, moved into an Edwardian house in Southsea, Hampshire with her mother and grandparents. Judy recounted that from the beginning, there was a disturbing presence in the house that seemed particularly focused on the younger residents. Her mother felt it to some degree, but her grandparents appeared completely unaware of it. Judy's mother believed that this presence harbored a dislike for the young, manifesting more intensely the younger the person was. While there weren't many visual apparitions though, the sensation of a so-called presence was strong and frequently felt throughout the house. One particular afternoon, Judy's grandmother and great-aunt experienced what could be considered a sighting. When one of them left the room to go to the bathroom, she glanced up and saw a man looking over the top of the stairwell from a couple of flights above. Confident there should have been no one else in the house at the time, they thought it might be an intruder. Both women, fearless and determined, grabbed a poker each and searched the house. Despite their thorough search though, they found no one and no evidence of a break-in at all. Judy herself had only one visual encounter, which was rather vague. She perceived a shadow in the hallway that didn't align with the lighting or the arrangement of the objects around. The shadow suggested the outline of a man wearing a Homburg hat. Judy though was certain that the figure casting the shadow had to be standing just outside her grandfather's room, hidden from her view. However, what Judy described as the real thing went beyond fleeting shadows. She felt a profoundly disturbing presence in her room at night. It said she could hear the footsteps crossing the floor and approaching a basket chair in the front room, which would then creak under the weight of an unseen visitor. Judy even considered the possibility of these being residual or recording type ghost sounds, which are echoes of past events. Yet, the sound of breathing accompanied these footsteps, which added to her sense of a live presence. The family attempted to ease her fears by moving her to another room, which unfortunately Judy later considered to be the center of the house's paranormal activity. One night, she woke up convinced that something absolutely horrific was in the corner of this new room. She saw nothing but could feel its presence intensely, describing it as pulsating. This sensation grew even stronger, and Judy felt the entity focusing on her, which she found absolutely terrifying. Frozen in fear and sweating profusely, she eventually managed to move and turn on the light, but it made no difference since she felt the presence was still there, growing stronger. In desperation, Judy escaped the room and ran to her mother's bed, shaking so violently that the bed rattled. Her parents tried to dismiss her experience as a nightmare, but Judy was certain it was not. Years later, after her grandparents passed away, her mother returned to clear out the house, which had been sold. Despite it being the middle of summer, she was struck by an unnerving chill as soon as she entered the empty house, describing it as walking into an icy cold that she had never experienced before. Old Madame. In the early 20th century, the Rev. Sabine Baring-Gould documented several ghostly encounters at the Liu House in Tavistock, Devon, believed to be haunted by Old Madame, a white lady ghost. This apparition is thought to be Margaret Belfield, who married William Gould in 1740 and died in 1795. According to Baring-Gould's account from 1923, the spirit of Old Madame was particularly active, manifesting in various, sometimes disturbing ways. The ghost of Old Madame was reputed to walk along a long upstairs corridor that extended from the main staircase of Liu House to stairs at the other end of the building. Baring-Gould recounted how his mother heard the sound of high-heeled shoes walking slowly along the corridor despite the corridor being well lit and no visible presence detected. His mother attempted to follow these footsteps but never saw anyone. On a separate occasion, Baring-Gould's sister was in her room writing a letter when she heard similar footsteps. Upon opening the door to investigate, she found the hallway completely empty. Baring-Gould himself suggested rats might be responsible for these sounds, although this explanation satisfied few. And adding to that eerie atmosphere, Baring-Gould's daughter, Barbara, once reported seeing a lady in blue who would enter her nursery, look at her quietly, sometimes even sitting by her bed. Another daughter, Diana, recounted an experience where her nurse was awoken by a tap on the door and a female voice instructing that it was time for Diana's medicine. When the nurse opened the door to see who it was, no one was there. Perhaps though, the most chilling account occurred when Baring-Gould himself spent a night in the room where Old Madame had died. His wife, caring for their ill daughter Beatrice in the same room, woke him in distress, claiming she could hear people tramping down the stairs, carrying something heavy. Baring-Gould dismissed it as noises caused by the windy night. Tragically though, the next day their daughter Beatrice passed away, and her coffin was carried down the same staircase, producing the very noises his wife had described the night before, suggesting a ghostly premonition or warning. But the hauntings at Liu House was not limited to family experiences. In 1918, 2 nurses left their positions with the family, frightened by sightings of a female form walking in the nursery and stooping over the children's beds at night. Local lore and sightings of Madame Gould continued outside the confines of the house as well. She was often seen near a local lake, scooping up water, with her figure reportedly sparkling as if covered with water drops. Even visitors unrelated to the family reported eerie encounters. One notable instance involved Mr. Simmons, who, unaware of Madame Gould's recent death, saw her in moonlight sitting on a plow. He greeted her politely, only to learn later that she had been buried a week prior. This encounter, among others, reinforced the spectral reputation of old Madame, mixing her presence with both the family's and local community's experience. Sabine Baring-Gould also speculated about the identity of the White Lady, suggesting she might have been Susanna Gould, who died in her bridal clothes in 1729 rather than Margaret Belfield. Shoe. In 1950, in Anglesey, Wales, a curious case of ghostly activity was reported involving a young family and the spirit of a former sea captain. The Rev. J. Aylwin Roberts, lacking psychic sensitivities himself, often collaborated with individuals from the Psychic Research Society who possessed these abilities. For this particular investigation, he was accompanied by Aylwin Roberts, a member of the society known for his ultra-sensitive abilities. The household in question belonged to Peter and Bridget and their 3-year-old son, Oliver. The family had established a routine where Peter would play with Oliver each evening until the child's bedtime at 7 o'clock. However, a strange event would occur nightly at 9 o'clock, coinciding with the chiming of Big Ben during the television news. Oliver would seemingly sleepwalk down the stairs to the living room. Each time, Bridget would gently guide her son back to his bed without incident. Intriguingly, on nights when Peter preemptively went upstairs around 9 o'clock to observe his son, Oliver would remain in bed, asleep and undisturbed. Curious about this nightly occurrence, Peter decided to ask Oliver why he left his bed. Oliver explained that an old man, whom he described as wearing a long nightdress and a naughty cap, had instructed him to get out of bed and go to his parents. This figure, according to Oliver, would shoo him out of his room. Upon visiting the family home, Aylwin Roberts immediately sensed a presence. He spent some time in Oliver's room, and after careful consideration, he suggested that relocating the child's bed might resolve the issue. The family followed his advice, moving the bed while Oliver was still in it. That night, as predicted by Aylwin, the ghostly disturbances ceased, and Oliver did not leave his bed at the usual time. Aylwin theorized that the original placement of the bed obstructed a path that the ghost preferred to walk. This theory seemed to hold weight as the nightly disruptions did not recur after the bed was moved. Further context to these events was provided by an 86-year-old neighbor who remembered the house's previous occupant, a sea captain named Lucas. Captain Lucas, who had lived there with his 2 daughters, Lucille and Victoria, was known to have a fondness for whiskey. According to a neighbor, in his later years, the captain would consume up 2 bottles of whiskey a day and spent his days wandering the house in a long nightshirt and a weird sleeping cap, never bothering to dress fully. This description matched Oliver's account of the old man, suggesting that Captain Lucas, now deceased, was perhaps reliving his routine in the house, unintentionally influencing the young boy. Rev. Aylwin Roberts concluded that the restless spirit of Captain Lucas was likely responsible for shooing Oliver back to his parents each night, perhaps out of a misguided sense of care or habit from his living days. Suterfell. On Midsummer Eve in 1735, a farmhand working on a farm owned by Mr. Lancaster looked up from the field and saw something strange on Sutherfell. Sutherfell, located on the northern side of the Kiswick to Penrith Road near the village of Scales and the peak known as Blencathra, is about 900 feet high and steep, inaccessible sides. The farmhand saw a huge army marching from east to west until it disappeared into a cleft in the mountainside. He told Mr. Lancaster what he had seen, but he dismissed his claims. The local villagers also mocked the story, but it was 2 years later on the same night that Mr. Lancaster saw something similar. He saw men dismounting from their horses at a high altitude where no hunt could take place. After about 10 minutes, he saw what seemed to be a regiment of cavalry followed by infantry and some stragglers. The whole group then disappeared into the mountainside, and Mr. Lancaster and his family, who had witnessed the event, shared their story with the villagers. Despite the earlier ridicule, they faced more scorn. On Midsummer Eve in 1745, Mr. Lancaster was ready for another sighting. He brought 26 other people to verify what they might see. They all ended up seeing an army moving over the summit of Sutherfell. This time, even carriages were seen. The procession lasted for some time, leaving the group amazed. The next day, many of them climbed back to look for evidence, but they found no hoof marks or wheel tracks, even though less than 24 hours had passed. Their statements were sworn before a magistrate. After this event, others who had seen something similar but had kept quiet out of fear or ridicule began to come forward. Mr. Wren of Wilton Hall recounted that in 1745, he and his farmhand had seen a man and a dog chasing wild horses in a dangerous part of Sutherfell. They believed it was not possible for the figures to be there in body, only in spirit, due to terrain. Despite various suggestions like mirages or visions, the Lancaster family maintained that what they had seen was indeed real. The Visit from Beyond. Brandon recounts the events of the winter of 1999 in Erie, Pennsylvania, when his uncle Len went missing. Len was like a brother to Brandon, and they shared many hobbies like hunting, fishing, trapping, and racing dirt bikes and four-wheelers. They were in constant contact, so when Len stopped answering calls for 3 days, it was very unusual. Brandon contacted their grandmother, who also hadn't heard from Len. Concerned, Brandon decided to check Len's apartment on 6th Street. Len's truck wasn't parked outside and no one answered the door. Brandon left a note hoping for a response, and after a day with no word, Brandon returned to find the note still in place. Growing concerned, he and his grandmother filed a missing persons report with the police. The police assured them that most missing persons return home within a few days. But a week passed with no news. Brandon drove around checking places they used to frequent, hoping to find Len's truck. He searched hunting spots, fishing locations, and woods with trap lines, but found nothing. One night, about a month after Len's disappearance, Brandon woke up in the middle of the night to find his bedroom extremely cold. He could see his breath and was shaking despite being wrapped in blankets. Thinking his furnace had broken, he got up to check it. As he walked through the hallway and into the kitchen, he saw Len sitting at the kitchen table, wearing his winter jacket and John Deere baseball cap. Len's skin was pale, his beard was white with ice, and his eyes were cloudy. Brandon was terrified. He asked Len where he had been but received no answer. When he turned on the light, Len looked even more lifeless, like a zombie. He then stood up and moved towards Brandon with his joints stiff and awkward. The light bulb suddenly then exploded, plunging the room into darkness. Brandon could hear Len's boots scraping across the floor, and the room grew colder as Len approached. The smell of decay filled the air, and just as suddenly as it started, the cold and the presence of Len disappeared. The room returned to normal, and Len was gone. The next morning, Brandon found muddy boot prints on the kitchen floor and a broken light bulb, evidence that the encounter had been real. He told his grandmother, who believed Len was dead. Soon after, Len's truck was found buried in a snowdrift by kids on four-wheelers, and his body was discovered in the spring by a man walking his dogs. The family held a funeral for Len, but the memory of that night stayed with Brandon. He missed Len, but hoped never to see him again in the same way. The Boy on the Ceiling. In high school, a Redditor was working at a place that hosted kids' birthday parties in a giant gym, which also held gymnastics and dance classes, which led to an unusual experience. One day, a very spiritual and religious coworker arrived visibly freaked out. During the gymnastics class she taught that morning, one of the kids stared at the ceiling and said, "There's a little boy up there," pointing to the ceiling. Later, two girls working at a birthday party before another shift came out of the gym visibly disturbed. They reported that a pair of 5-year-old twins had gone down a slide and then stared at the ceiling, saying there was a little boy up there, in the same spot mentioned by the child from the gymnastics class. Inspecting the ceiling revealed nothing unusual, just a regular gray warehouse-style ceiling. Despite this, everyone felt unsettled. During another party, a little boy being pushed on a giant swing also began to stare at the ceiling, saying, "Hey, there's a little boy up there." This made 3 separate instances in one day where different children claimed to see a boy on the ceiling. The co-workers and managers were also informed about the 3 separate experiences. The next day, during downtime between parties, the gym was completely empty. Cameras in the gym streamed footage to the lobby for parents to watch their children. The manager called everyone out of the break room to check the screen, which showed the giant swing moving back and forth with no one in the gym. The sight of the swing moving on its own was pretty disturbing. Reflecting on these events, it seemed plausible that the ghost might be a little boy who had just wanted to play, providing some comfort amidst the unease. The Haunted Lighthouse. When visiting a lighthouse in Michigan known for its tales of haunting, an 11-year-old had an experience that continues to puzzle and unsettle. The family was on a tour of various sites in the Upper Peninsula, and the parents decided to join a guided tour of the lighthouse. Meanwhile, the child opted to stay outside and play, as there was no one else around and the area seemed safe. While playing near the lighthouse, a worn-out ball unexpectedly rolled up to the child's feet. The child picked up the ball, only to notice a boy standing by the edge of the lighthouse, watching intently. Assuming the ball belonged to the boy, it was tossed back to him. The boy then wandered away, and nothing seemed particularly odd at that moment. After the parents finished their tour, they asked about the child's activities. The child casually mentioned playing around and returning a ball to a boy. The tour guide, who was with the parents, reacted with surprise. He explained that there should have been no one else at the lighthouse, as only 3 cars were in the parking area, being the parents' car, the tour guide's car, and the car of the person at the front desk. Curious and a bit unsettled, the tour guide led the child back into the lighthouse to show a picture. When shown the photograph, the child recognized the boy immediately. It was the same boy seen outside, still holding the same upbeat ball. The tour guide revealed that the boy in the photograph had died at the lighthouse many years ago. This revelation brought a new level of eeriness to the experience. The boy had appeared solid, interacted in a typical manner, and even the ball felt entirely real when touched. The fact that the child had physically handled an object associated with a ghost was deeply disturbing. In most ghost stories, apparitions don't usually have physical objects with them, making this encounter even more weird. So that ends the video. I hope you all enjoyed. Thank you all so much for watching. This was the first video actually back from the break, so look forward to a bunch more. I'm really happy to be back. Drop anything in the comments, and thank you for watching.